Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to a very special online event today. It's called Reclaim Your Connection with the Departed. Discover how to collaborate with those on the other side to make miracles in your life. My name is Stephen Dinan. I'm the founder and president of the Shift Network, and we've been on a fascinating exploration, really, of how to bridge to the other side, work with our ancestors, resolve patterns in a kind of multidimensional way, and we're going to get to go deeper into that work with a remarkable teacher here today. Her name is Perdita Finn. She's the author and co-founder of the non-denominational international fellowship, The Way of the Rose, and we're going to really find out some novel ways to really reach across that veil and really create a collaborative partnership. So Perdita, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Stephen. I'm really excited about this course and this event today.
Great. As you mentioned, we do have a brand new program coming up, a new course with Perdita that is really going to be groundbreaking. It's called Collaborate with Your Ancestral Spirits to Manifest the Miraculous. So we'll share more about that towards the end of the hour. So Perdita, I always like to start our journeys with a little bit of your personal backstory. It situates really the bigger why you got drawn into this work and dedicated so many decades to it.
Sure. Well, my whole life in some ways has led me here, and the dead have been calling to me my whole life. But I grew up in a sort of atheist bohemian family, very psychologically bent, a lot of psychoanalysts, and not much acknowledgement of the world of the dead. And so I grew up with a lot of anxiety about death and dying. There weren't many rituals for death. There wasn't much conversation about what happened after you died. And there certainly was no conversation about the dead themselves. And yet I experienced the dead showing up in visions and dreams, in my intuition and my imagination. And I found it quite frightening, actually, Stephen. And right about the birth of my first child, I began to reach out to the dead. I began to really, I think something about the portal opening with that birth, something shifted. I write a lot about this in my book, Take Back the Magic. And I couldn't tell you what I was doing. I had been a Zen student. I had converted to Catholicism for about 2.5 seconds. I had done all kinds of mystical workshops and teachings trying to explore what I was doing. And then very privately, I began to pray to the dead. I began to call on them by name. I began to offer them prayers. I began to offer them food. I began to talk to them, and they began to show up. And they really began to show up, so much so that it was almost destabilizing. I couldn't even believe the miracles that began to happen. And it was very private. I didn't have a language for it, a program for it, a context for it. And then 13 years ago, my daughter became very, very ill. She was 17 years old, and her entire immune system collapsed. And we took her to many, many doctors. I was a doctor's daughter. He was this materialist atheist, right? But he was also the guy you called whenever you were sick. He always knew the guy, the best expert, the specialist, the person who would make everything all better. But my father had died the year before, and he wasn't there to guide us. And so we were going to the fanciest doctors in New York and the fanciest doctors in Boston, and no one could tell us what was the matter with her. They could only tell us that she was really, really sick. And if you've ever had a sick child who nobody can fix, who's in terrible agony and pain, you'll do anything. And I was at the gym one day, and I just collapsed in tears. And a very old woman came up to me and said, "You need to go see a psychic." I had never been to a psychic. And I thought, I hate living in Woodstock, New York. I live in a very new age town. I don't need a psychic, I need a doctor. And she said, "Go to see the psychic. She'll help you." So she wrote down the name of this woman who owned a little shop in town, who didn't advertise. She told me that she might see me, she might not. You couldn't make an appointment. You just walked in and saw what happened. And I put it in my bag and said, forget about it. And I came home, and my daughter was weeping in agony and said to me, "Mommy, I got to get out of my body. My body hurts too much." And I didn't know what to do. And I got in the car and I drove into town and I walked into this tiny little store. And there was this tiny little woman in this tiny little store. And she looked up at me and she said, "Oh, you've come about your daughter." And I was instantly startled. And I said, "I have." Now, I have to go backtrack and tell you one other thing I forgot to tell you, which was my father was this cantankerous doctor, cantankerous emergency room doctor. And when I was a child, whenever the phone would ring, he would pick up the phone and say, forgive me for using this language. My father would say, "Jesus H. effing Christ, who is it this time?" And a friend could be calling me, and my father would answer the phone that way. Somebody from the hospital was calling. That's how my father answered the phone. So go back to the psychic's room. I'm there. I walk in with her, and she says, "I'm going to talk to you about your daughter. Come in back to this other room." And now I know it's very surprising that she was willing to see me because she was very reluctant. In fact, I wrote a book about her called The Reluctant Psychic. And she didn't always like to do readings for people. And she was just very intuitive and almost feral. And she sits me down on a little chair with a Hello Kitty decal and says, "Oh, your father's here. Oh, excuse me. He's using very bad language. I'm very sorry." And I said, what's he saying? And she said, "Jesus effing Christ, Perdita, what is it this time?" And no one knew that about my father. I mean, how did she know that? Suddenly, my entire reality turned inside out. It was as if for years I'd been talking to the dead and calling on the dead and experiencing miracles with the dead. But I hadn't realized how real the dead are, how present they are, how available they are to us. And the next thing she said was, my father had led me to the psychic. I didn't need a doctor. I needed her. And she indeed began to guide me to the people who would help my daughter, to the insights that would help our family navigate this terrible, terrible event, which she did. And I began an apprenticeship with her. And she was the person who convinced me that everyone is psychic, that she could talk to the dead in her way, but I had been talking to the dead for years without realizing how real that conversation was. And that's when I began to realize that what I had recovered and found my way to doing, I could teach other people how to do. I could help anybody access their psychic powers. If I had done it, anybody could do it. And that was sort of the turning point in my journey in working with the dead. And since then, I've helped many, many, many people manifest tremendous miracles with the help of their loved ones on the other side.
Well, what an amazing backstory. I mean, that touched me really deeply. And would it be on the precipice with your daughter like that? And wow, what a powerful initiation into collaborating across the veil. So you had said that when you first started, you were doing a lot of praying to and making offerings. I know that's typical in a lot of indigenous cultures, Mexican culture, places that really sort of make a point of kind of inviting spirits in with food and offerings. And I wonder if you can share. I
learned it from Buddhism, actually, Stephen. Buddhism, it's also.
I'm just wondering, is that sort of an important foundation to set? So you have the kind of the psychic communication channel, and then there's this other kind of more peripheral summoning kind of, maybe share a little bit about how do you start to really make that connection real?
Well, our ancestors always made space for the dead in their lives. And a long time ago, 10,000 years ago, people used to, that was really literal. They would bury the skulls of their ancestors in their homes. The Natufian people would do that. And our more near ancestors their dead would be in the backyard in a family graveyard. They were very close. The dead weren't far away. They didn't have pictures of the dead. You see my ancestor altar behind me. But the dead were part of their lives. And people died at home. Lots of people died at home. They didn't go to the hospital to die. You didn't go to an old age home. There were often children dying or old people dying in the home. So death was close. There was space for the dead and for the dying in the home. And what we want to do is make space for the dead in our lives. And, I'll be talking in the course I teach about a lot of different ways to do that. There's no one formula for it. Every culture has a tradition of doing this. And there are a lot of different ways to make it possible. You see it at the Passover Seder when you know a glass of wine is poured for Elijah and for Miriam, and the door is open to let Elijah in. You see it in feeding the hungry ghosts in Buddhism, and we see it in the Mexican Day of the Dead. But there are lots of other ways to do it. There are a lot of really fun ways to acknowledge the presence of the dead in our lives. One of the simplest ways to realize how close the dead are, Stephen, is to go outside, wherever you are. I don't care if you're in the city, the country, the suburbs, wherever. Scrape up a little dirt in your fingers. Hold that dirt in your hand and look at it. Because wherever the dirt is that you're holding in your hand, you are holding the bodies of the dead. Dead trees, dead plants, dead insects, dead animals, dead mountains. Where I live, the mountains were formed from oceans years ago. Their sea creatures are creating the dirt in my hand. Every bit of dirt is made from the bodies of the dead, and they quite literally bear us up. They're the ground beneath our feet. We don't even have to put the skulls into the foundations of our houses to realize that our lives rest atop the bodies of the dead. So invite everybody to do that. I also like to go, I keep on my ancestor altar. Whenever I go to cemeteries or I go to visit ancestors, the homes of ancestors, the birthplaces of ancestors, the graves of ancestors, I'll often take a little dirt home with me and put it on my ancestor altar. And you can do that too.
That's a whole reformulation of how we approach dirt that is really, really very intriguing.
Dirt's where everything grows, Stephen. Nothing grows without dirt, and nothing grows without the bodies of the dead. You know, when trees drop their limbs, they are feeding their bodies with life, with death. And, you know, people are beginning to compost themselves when they die, and the revelation that everything grows from the bodies of the dead.
It's beautiful.
It's not so frightening.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, you know, with the woman that you apprenticed with, the psychic, so for you, is this revelatory getting actual words and specific details that really shifted the whole paradigm and made it more present. How important do you feel like it is to have that kind of evidential communication link built so that it becomes like that much more real?
I think there are a number of different ways that we want to make it real. And one way that we can make it real, and this is what the whole course I'm teaching is about, is by giving ourselves our own evidence of the presence of the dead. And that's through our collaboration with them. A miracle becomes its own proof of the reality of the death. Grow something from the bodies of the dead, and you'll know it's real. And I'll tell a lot of stories about that and how that can happen. But we also can come into community. And one of the things is we begin to shift what I call our belief sphere in community. Other people are doing this. We hear about other people's miracles, and our miracles begin to weave together in all kinds of miraculous, astounding ways. I'll give you another story to give you some idea of what that can look like, what it can feel like, and how much fun it can be to work with the dead. My daughter ultimately did get diagnosed with a rare, incurable genetic condition that necessitated going to more doctors and needing to learn more about prayer and more about collaboration with the other side. It was really quite an initiation for our entire family. And those doctors' visits were often terrifying, frightening, destabilizing, disempowering. The medical system is not a lot of fun. And on one of these visits during COVID, we were headed into New York City, and my daughter was going to see a cardiologist, which is a very frightening thing, to find out if there was this thing the matter with her heart. And I was not going to be able to go into the visit with her because of COVID. And she was very scared. So on the drive down into New York City, I'm calling on the dead. I'm calling on my father, the doctor. I'm calling on all his friends who were doctors. I am calling on all the nurses at the hospital I used to know who are on the other side. I am calling on anyone I can think of. And out of the blue, Stephen, I remember this man in my town. I grew up in a little tiny town on Cape Cod, and I remembered the ice cream man. His name was Vigo Peterson, and he had a little shop called Peterson's Ice Cream. And every night he made fresh ice cream, and then he posted the flavors he'd made outside the shop the next day, and everybody would get excited and say, oh, we made blueberry, oh, we made strawberry, and everybody would run down to get the ice cream. But Vigo himself was a cantankerous, grumpy guy and very unhappy. The backstory was he had wanted to be a doctor, and his father, an immigrant from Sweden, hadn't let him and had made him take over the ice cream business. And he was very angry, and he hated the ice cream business. And so he turned this ice cream parlor into like an operating room. It was so clean and so hygienic. And he had all these young women who worked for him, and he made them wear hairnets and gloves, and he yelled at them, and he tortured them by treating them like, nurses in an operating room. But he loved my father, and my father would bring him in to watch surgery sometimes. And so they got along. I thought about Vigo on the trip into New York City, and I said to him, Vigo, bring some sweetness to this visit. I don't know how you're going to do it. You get to be on the medical team from the other side. Well, and it is a miracle. If you know our medical system, you know it's a miracle. My daughter goes into this appointment. She's shaking in terror. An hour later, she comes out and says, Mom, I love this cardiologist. She said, I'm doing everything right, and I'm doing so well. And she's so excited about how well I take care of myself. And she says, everything's going to be okay when we work together. And I have to tell you, that was a miracle, Stephen. A good doctor is a miracle in our culture. And I came home, and I was teaching a course on the dead, and I tell the story I've just told you. And there is a woman in my class from Canada, and she's listening, and she looks at me and she says, you didn't grow up in Marion, Massachusetts, did you? This is a tiny town of 2,000 people in Massachusetts. I said, I did. That's the town. She said, my sister spent a summer working for Vigo Peterson, and it was the worst summer of her life. He tortured her. She hated it. She talked about him for years as the worst person she'd ever worked for in her whole life. He was legendary in our family. I was laughing. I said, I know, I can imagine. I probably got an ice cream cone from her. And she said, but my daughter, my sister has cancer right now. Would it be all right if I asked Vigo to help her heal? I said, of course. This was such a strange synchronicity. The dead start to weave us together. Her sister's in remission, and she thanks Vigo for helping make that happen. And Vigo is on every medical team I ever put together. He's fantastic, and you can use him too. So I'm sure, Stephen, I've wandered off course a little bit, but that's some of what can happen when you begin to work with the dead.
There's so many layers. So when you're talking about miracles, it's not necessarily something like poof out of thin air. It's more just like something happens that's so aligned, so sort of perfectly synchronistic in some ways that it just like something, it's just like shakes your world up. Is that kind of what you're talking about with miracles?
I would say miracles are organic. A shooting star can feel like a miracle, right? When it shoots across, you can't anticipate it, you can't predict it, and then you see it, and poof. Falling in love can feel like a miracle, particularly in the world of online dating, right? You can feel like a real miracle to find someone you love and who loves you back. Healing can be a miracle. Getting a parking space can feel like a miracle sometimes. All kinds of things can feel like a miracle. In our technological age, we've come to think of miracles as like Shazam, Wowie, Star Wars, explosions. But our ancient ancestors knew that it was a miracle to find food sometimes that you needed. It was a miracle to find love. It was a miracle to figure out what plant would create healing. And these miracles grew out of our relationship with the unseen world, that we planted the seeds of our desires in the soil of the dead, and the miracle would grow for them. And we know if we watch, and in springtime, every growing thing feels like a miracle. And much of what we can learn about prayer and miracles, we can learn from the natural world. I believe that the plants and the animals and the rivers understand miracles in ways we cannot imagine. And the dead understand miracles. They understand how miracles grow because we grow miracles in the dirt of the dead. They're the miracle grow we need for growing.
I love that. So it sounds like when you're creating a communication or inviting a miracle with working with the dead, that you have an intention or an outcome, but it's a little bit create space for how does that happen, it sounds like, so that they can kind of bring in some of the mystery or help to make something happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. Is that sort of how you hold it?
Yeah, when talking about mystery, we can't see a shooting star if we stay in our hyperlit, fluorescent lit homes, right? We have to go out into the darkness. We have to step into the darkness of a dark night in a dark place, and then we'll see all the constellations and we can get that shooting star. So we step into the mystery and we invite the mystery to start working with us in the darkness. And we've come to think, in capitalism and in this moment that it's a miracle and prayer is like we put in our quarter to the vending machine and out shoots our candy bar or a dollar bill or whatever it is nowadays. But a miracle is different. A miracle is not knowing what we're going to get when we offer up our hearts. Help. I don't know the answer. I've given up control. I don't know where this is going. Help me. And then we have to learn to look around. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this course, Stephen, is first of all, how we ask for help, how we summon the dead, and then how we collaborate and communicate with them and dance with them so that we can begin to experience and grow that a miracle. Every gardener knows you don't just put the seed in the ground. You have to know where to put it in the ground and how and when to put it in the ground and how much water and sunlight it needs and when it needs to be tended and when it needs to be left alone. And so there is a lot of lost lore about growing a miracle that we can recover together. And we do that with the help of the dead.
How important is it to really, so there's the kind of praying for a miracle, inviting Vigo to sort of into your medical team, or how important is it to kind of create that two-way linkage of communication or conversation like you had with your father?
It's all about intimacy and relationship, Stephen. It's all about love, finally. It comes down to love. And what we begin to realize is how loved we are by all those on the other side and how held we are. And what happens when we begin to feel the reciprocity of those relationships, when we no longer feel alone? It's transformative. It's how we move from fear to faith. And how, I talked in the beginning about I was someone who grew up frightened of death and the dead because I grew up in a modern world that banished it to far away. And the culture was filled with horror movies. And, you should be frightened of the haunted house and the darkness. Dirt is dirty, dark is frightening and bad. The dead are out to get you. I'm no longer frightened of the dead. I'm no longer frightened of death. And I'm no longer even frightened of the dark. Everything grows in the dark. We grow in the darkness of our mother's bodies. Seeds grow in the darkness of the ground and the dirt. And they're safe there in that dark place. We actually torture people by leaving the lights always on, not by putting them in the darkness, but by leaving them in the light. And I've become quite fascinated by the history of being frightened of the dead and where that come from and how that happened. And it's really interesting because our ancestors were not frightened of the dead. I don't think there's any evidence. I think they experienced tremendous fluidity between the land of the living and the land of the dead. And they walked atop the bodies of the dead. They told the stories of their ancestors, and they experienced their ancestors as always coming and going and helping them. But at a certain point in our development as into civilization, as a civilized people, we became frightened of death and we became frightened of the dead. And what we actually see happening is that religious authorities tried to make people frightened of the dead quite explicitly. A number of feminist scholars have written about this, Stephen. I'm going to get too wonky here, but there's a wonderful writer called Max Dashu who's documented a lot of early teachings about this. And the priests and the bishops were always trying to get women, particularly, but everybody, to stop talking to the dead. And the reason they wanted them to stop talking to the dead is because if you felt guided and consoled and helped by your ancestors, you didn't need a priest. You didn't need a religion. You had what you needed. You didn't need this whole institutional shtick. And so they had to silence the voices of the dead to get people to listen to them. They had to make it demonic. This gets even worse when we looked at what we call the European gynocide, sometimes called the witch craze, this 200-year period from the 1500s to about 1730, where many women, mostly women, some men, were persecuted as witches. The thing that women were most often accused of that got them in trouble was not midwifery, was not herbalism, it was speaking to the dead. This has been documented by a feminist scholar called Anne Barstow. And all over, and you talk to your dead mother, you talk to your dead grandmother, you asked her for help. This could get you accused and murdered during this period. What's fascinating to me is that this witch craze happens in the areas of Europe that are going to give birth to the modern world we live in. They were the areas of greatest education and highest learning in Germany and Scotland and England. In countries that were, quote, more backward and less educated, you didn't see these persecutions. Only in highly educated places. And even in America, we see that in Salem, that these persecutions were carried out by the good men of Harvard. They were the most educated men silencing the conversation with the unseen world. And the world we live in, the materialistic world we live in, is built on the silent voices of the dead. And why have those authorities wanted to silence that conversation so that the priests of religion or the priests of science can have authority? And what happens when we reactivate it, when we open it up again and empower ourselves to not be afraid? And that's what really begins to happen with this work, Stephen, is we stop being so afraid. I often say, I'm not frightened of the dead. I'm not frightened of ghosts and haunts and spirits. I am very frightened of the living. I am frightened of reasonable men making rational decisions in chrome boardrooms in cities around the world. But I'm not frightened of the dead. They've been through the worst. They've seen it all. And they've remembered who they really are. And part of this work is learning to let go of our fear of the dead. And as we let go of the fear of the dead, it really empowers us to live our lives without fear. And that can be very, very life-changing. I think I've gone on awful long for a long time.
No, well, that was some fascinating backstory. I didn't even know that about that. The number one reason women were accused of being witches was communicating with the dead. That's really illuminating right there. So it sounds like so there was a threat to the advice stream. You don't want to be taking advice from the dead because it sort of cuts the monopoly of the church. So let's go a little bit to the wisdom stream. So how do you start to kind of access more and more of the wisdom of the ancestors, not just their assistance in making a miracle happen here, but like that you're sort of really learning from them and that they're guiding you in a deep way?
Well, they remember everything, right? And they know everything. They can see everything. And I figure I've got, the grandmothers can remember. We can call on our ancestral grandmothers. There's a lot of talk these days about ancestral trauma, but it's also fun to talk about ancestral wisdom. And they hold it better than Google, better than the internet. I'll give you an example, Stephen. Last week, I woke up. I was supposed to give a keynote address for my book publisher. And I had been doing some gardening, and I had gotten the worst poison ivy infection, and my whole face was swollen shut, and barely could see. And for a lot of reasons, I can't take prednisone or steroids, which is the fast medical way of getting better from poison ivy. And I was like, what am I going to do? And I thought of my mother, who was a gardener, but she liked chemicals, and I didn't want a chemical solution. And out of the blue, I remembered an ancestor of mine who I knew had 13 children. She was from the 1600s in Rhode Island, and she had 13 kids. For the life of me, I couldn't remember her name, but she popped into my head. And I thought, if she had 13 kids, she knew how to deal with poison ivy. I'm sure she knew how to deal with poison ivy in an age before steroids. So what was her name? I got on the internet. And because she had 13 kids, she has a lot of descendants in America. If you're a Havens, you may be descended from this woman. And her name was Dionysia. so interesting a name. And sometimes called Denise. And she was sometimes called Dionysia, which was her formal name, and Denise, which was her nickname. I thought, oh, that's nice. I said, Denise, Dionysia, help me figure out my poison ivy. And off I marched to the local pharmacy, CVS, to see if there was any calamine lotion to put on my face. And I'm standing there in the aisle and I'm looking at this array of lotions and treatments, not knowing what to do. And a woman comes up to me and she says, you look like you're in trouble. I was like, yeah, I'm in trouble. And she said, have you ever tried witch hazel? I said, no. Does it work? She said, oh, yeah. She said, you're going to chill the witch hazel and then you're going to put up cold compresses on your face and it'll bring the swelling down. I said, okay, I will do that. And I said, how do you know? And she said, well, I'm a nurse. And I said, okay. And I picked up some witch hazel. And I said, thank you so much. What's your name? And of course, her name was Denise. So I had lost the lore about this treatment for poison ivy. But my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother still knew it. And I could reach to her to hold it. The ancestors are the memory holders. How are we going to navigate the coming changes of climate change, Stephen? How are we going to navigate all kinds of disruptions and changes that are most certainly coming down the pike? We're going to navigate them with the help of ancestors who've been through their own climate crises, who've survived volcanic eruptions and ice ages and meteor blasts. I sometimes pray to the dinosaurs for help. Help us not go extinct, you know. Our ancestors have seen it all, and they remember how to get through all this. Once the psychic, Susan Saxman, I wrote the book about, The Reluctant Psychic, she and I were coming back from an event, and we had to go through New York City, Grand Central Station at rush hour on a Friday. And we got out of our train and it was packed with people and the doors weren't open. And so people were pushing against each other in a way that was very frightening. And we didn't know where to go or what to do. And it felt a little unnerving in this dark place, bodies crammed together. And Susan turned to me and said, step to the right. I stepped to the right. And she said, step to the right again. And I stepped to the right. And she said, reach out your hand. And I reached my hand out and there was a doorknob. And I turned it and we stepped out onto 42nd Street. I said, how did you know to do that? And she said, oh, somebody dead told me to do that. And she said, and they said there's a smoothie place around the corner. I said, okay, we'll go to the smoothie place. Our whole lives can be like that. We don't have to remember things. The dead hold the memory of our species, of all life on this planet. And we can have access to those memories when we become in relationship to the dead.
I love how practical some of the advice is for the smoothie shop. Well,
we needed it after that.
I'm sort of struck by in talking to you is that I think so often when we think of communicating with the dead, we think of just our own recent ancestors or people that we actually knew. But you have a much wider aperture that you're sort of tapping people that you may or may not knew or dinosaurs. And so how important is that to just sort of like open the aperture and say, who are you intuitively guided to, which may or may not be in your lineage or ancestry to make
Well, that's a lot of what we're going to do in the course is thinking about who are the dead, who are my dead, what is my relationship to dead. And, you know, we've lived inside a linear idea of time and space for a long time, that time is a straight line with a past, present, and a future. And in fact, the physicists tell us time is kind of folded over itself in 12 different ways, and it's a little more complicated than that. And same with space. We don't just have one life, Stephen. We don't have just one mother and father. We have many mothers and fathers, many, many lovers, many friends, many parents. We have more people who love us than we can possibly imagine. And how do we access what I call the long story of our souls will be some of this work. You know, sometimes we talk about the veil being thin, but the veil is like a fabric of embroidery with threads woven in and out. And each of those threads is a soul. And our soul is a long thread woven back and forth, entangled with all other souls. And we look at that fabric from the wrong side when we're alive. We just see the knots, we see the things cut too short. If you have anyone ever done embroidery, which I did as a child, you can see, it's a mess on the back, right? It's a mess. Turn it over. And sunlight, you see the picture. You see how a red thread becomes a pair of lips, a rose. You see all of the patterns. The dead see the big picture through deep time of our souls. We live inside the short story of a single life. And it's very hard to experience mercy and generosity and love, or even wisdom inside a single life. It's like trying to understand a sentence from a single word. But when we can have access to that long story, many, many things become possible. So one of the things the dead help us learn to do is to see with the eyes of the dead and to see the long story of our own souls. And that becomes really life-changing, really, and very, very empowering. And you will find, we all know what it's like to meet someone and go, I know you. I don't know how I know you, but I know you. I've learned to trust those feelings.
Indeed, so have I. Well, you have so many great stories, and I think each one illuminates different points. So I'd love to just, have another couple stories that illuminate different things you want to bring forward about this kind of very real, vivid, practical relationship with the dead that you can have.
Oh, I have so many, Stephen. It's overwhelming. Give me a topic. Let's see. What do you want?
Earlier to ask you if there was any dead that wanted to say anything for this call, that in particular we're feeling like, are there any messages that want to be brought forward that are specific to this event we're in right now?
Well, you see behind me my ancestor altar with photographs of the dead, and these are friends, neighbors, teachers, pets, saints from all different traditions and all different religions who've shown up, and skulls and all kinds of people, and including, I keep over here cards of the dead. So you know what I'm going to do? I think we can have some fun. So give me just 1 minute, okay? One thing I won't be doing in this course, but I have done in other courses, is I create oracle decks of the dead. In fact, right now, top secret, don't tell my family, I'm creating a whole family oracle deck for my nieces and nephews with stories and photographs of all of our familial ancestors, so to use them as an oracle deck. And this is an oracle deck we created with a class I did. So let's see who wants to show up, and let's see what their message is, shall we? Let's see. All right, I'm just going to pull a card at random and see who shows up. Let's see. Okay. Isadora Duncan has shown up. She was one of the ancestors of the people in my class. And so what does Isadora Duncan want? I look at how free she is and look at how she's dancing. One of the things I often talk about is that we learn not to put in our coin to the vending machine of the other side and wait for a candy bar. We learn to dance with the dead, and the joy and liberation of dance, and the fun of dance, how ecstatic it is to dance, and what it feels like to be danced with by the dead. That's one of the things that feels wonderful. We begin to feel that everything is dancing. The whole world is in motion. When we start dancing with the dead, we start dancing with the whole natural world. We'll find that the animals are dancing with us. And one of the things we'll talk about is the kinds of animal communications that begin to happen when you work with the dead. For instance, on the night my daughter was first diagnosed officially with the genetic condition she has, which is incurable and untreatable. And it was very devastating, very frightening diagnosis. And it was January, and we went out for a walk in the darkness. She was very scared and overwhelmed. And I just held her hand, and we're walking on a dark road. And all of a sudden, an owl flew in front of us and landed right at eye level on a branch near us. So we stopped, and we looked at the owl. Now, I live in the woods, and I'm used to seeing a lot of wild animals. And you see an owl for a minute, and then it flies away, or a second, and it flies away. This owl wasn't going anywhere, just locked eyes with us. And finally, it was cold. It was, 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed, and my daughter and I bowed to the owl, said thank you, and we turned to walk away. And the owl swooped back and wrapped its wings and its body around my daughter and held her and then flew off. Now, that's what it feels like when we begin to dance with the dead. Everything starts showing up for us. The natural world starts to be in communication with us. The silencing of the dead was the silencing of the natural world. In fact, this was the beginning of scientists literally cutting the vocal cords of animals they were experimenting on because they wanted to silence them. And when we begin to reactivate the voices of the dead, the whole world begins to speak with us and begins to dance with us. So I think Isadora is inviting us all to the dance of the dead. That's enough of a message.
I love that. What an amazing story about the owl too. And so I love the synchronicity of just pulling a card to see what message wants to come through as well.
I love, and this is the thing. I have so many dead. I have a book coming out in September, Stephen. And if you've ever done a book, it's filled with like angst and turmoil. And so when I first submitted my book, it was called Take Back the Magic, Getting to Know the Dead. And my publisher, very wisely, said, we don't like the subtitle. We love the title. We don't love the subtitle. And then the editor proposed some other subtitles. And they really were like, I don't like them very much. And I started to get into that knotted, upset place. You can get like, oh, I don't like this. This is going bad. This is going south. So the first thing I did is I come to my altar. I look around. I say, who's on this problem? Well, I have a great aunt and uncle who just happened to have been screenwriters in Hollywood, and they helped write the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And I figure that's a pretty good movie. People really liked that movie. They had a good sense of things. They knew how to tell a story. So I called on Francis and Albert, my great aunt and uncle. I said, help me with this. Within 10 minutes, my editor had returned with the new subtitle for my book and said, what about if we call it Conversations with the Unseen World? And I said, oh my gosh, I love it. It's so much better than anything I would have ever come up with. The dead, they show up, they help.
I love it. And it seems like, you have a way of also just being very fluid about who you're tapping for what purpose and setting up teams for medical visits. And do you have kind of like a whole architecture of people that you kind of will call upon for different areas of your life, it sounds like?
Oh, yeah. And we'll look at different ways. Like, sometimes, there's the immediate emergency, like help me get a human being on the telephone, right? Okay. I always call on the dead for help with that. And that's a miracle when you get a human being on the other line. But then there are projects that are big team projects. You know what I mean? Like I have long-term projects I'm working on with the dead. I am a mother. I have 2 children. I fret. I worry. I worry about my kids. I am an aunt. I have nieces and nephews. I worry about my nieces and nephews. I worry. I have friends. I worry about my friends. I worry about their kids. I worry about the pets. I worry about everybody. But I have so many helpers and so many different people to call on, and it's really fun.
Well, you are such a breath of fresh air and really open up a whole different paradigm of how to relate with the dead in really beautiful and collaborative ways. So I want to spend some time talking more explicitly about your upcoming program, since I think it's really going to open up so many doors for people and really be a mind-blowing, heart-expanding adventure for them. So the program is called Collaborate with Your Ancestral Spirits to Manifest the Miraculous. Bring powerful synchronicities, messages, and gifts into your life. You can see it at the URL collaboratewiththedead.com, collaboratewiththedead.com. It's a 7-week program. You don't have to be psychic or have any background in this material. It's just if you're intuitively drawn, if you feel like, oh, this would be cool, this would be fun, this would be amazing and be healing to develop this partnership and relationship across the veil, then you're warmly welcome to participate. So Perdita, I'd love for you to share a little bit about the bigger why, like why take this journey with you? How do people's lives shift? And then I'll read out the module titles so you can give us a preview what's coming in each.
Sure. On the one hand, Stephen, I've given you everything you need to get going. The dead are real. They want to play with you. They want to collaborate with you. There, it's it. Take it. Run with it. On the other hand, in our culture, we've lost so much of the lore about how to do that. And so one of the things this course offers us is an opportunity to move very, very slowly to recover these lost ways of working with the dead. We begin by learning how to summon them, how to use our senses, our traditions, our intuition, and our imagination to create space for the dead in our lives and call them to us. And we'll think about, who are we calling? How? Why? Who are the dead that are calling to us? How do we think beyond simple lineages? And I'm going to talk a lot about why lineages are oppressive, and they're a tool of oppression in our culture. We don't have lineages. There are no straight lines in nature, and there are no straight lines among the dead. It's all entanglement. And so how to access that entanglement and play with it and begin to pull on it will be where we begin, summoning the dead.
So module 1 is called Open a Portal to the Dead to Experience the Presence and Wisdom of Your Ancestors.
And then once we've done that and we've begun, and you will be stunned. Here's the thing I can promise. Miracles will happen. You know, I once worked with a guy and he had no photos of anyone in his family. I said, we worked out solutions and ways and things for him to do. 2 weeks into the course, a box of photos were sent to him from a fourth cousin of everyone in his family. The dead will start to show up for us when we begin to call on them. And when they start to show up, we learn how to work with them and how to collaborate with them. What kind of jobs are appropriate for the dead? How do we assign them? What does that look like in terms of daily rituals and daily habits? What do we need to know about timing? There's a lot of lost lore about prayer that we're going to explore in this second session. How do we dance with the dead? You know, dancing is a lost art too. We've forgotten the steps, the movement, the rhythm, the timing. How do we do it? How do we work? How do we step onto the dance floor? How do we listen to what's coming back at us? How do we get that miracle beginning to grow? And we'll look at a lot of different ways. And we'll also explore how to work with what I call the difficult dead, the dead we don't trust, the dead we don't like, the dead we're furious at and have real grudges against. So we'll take a look at all of that in the second session.
So that's the second session. And then the third session is Speak the Language of Eternity to Master Communication with the Departed.
Well, that's what the owl I was talking about, which is, how do we hear what the dead are saying to us? How do we receive their messages? And there's so many different traditional ways for doing this, from dreams, from oracles, psychics, oracle cards that I just showed you. But the oldest oracle deck is the natural world itself. Every bird is an oracle card. Every tree and cloud is an oracle card. And how do we re-enter that conversation with the natural world? And that can be such a generative, loving conversation once we begin to reactivate it. But I'll be talking about a lot of different ways to actively communicate with the dead and hear what they have to say.
Module 4, Become the Dead for Rebirth, Renewal, and Reunions.
Reincarnation. We've all been here before. What does that mean? Does it just mean we have been somebody else? What does it mean to know that we have multiplicities within us? Not just human lives, but animal lives, plant lives, mountain lives. What does it mean to access the wisdom of those past lives? How can the dead help us do that? How can we also access the love of our past mothers, our ancient mothers, mothers from lives we barely remember, animal mothers, tree mothers, moss mothers? I mean this very literally. We have access to more love, more healing than we can possibly imagine. There's so much talk about ancestral trauma these days, but we have ancestral resources we're not tapping into. And we can do that through what I call the long story of our souls. In many ways, it is the most comforting, generative story there is. It's a story where there is always enough time. I always say you could be 98 years old. My grandmother-in-law, my husband's grandmother, she lived to 105. And at 100, she was still trying new things, knowing she would take that with her into the next life. How do we live our lives if we know we have all the time in the world? That's what we'll look at then.
Great stuff. Module 5 then is Embrace Soul Appointments for Guidance, Help, and Nourishment.
Everyone here has a death that's been really hard. I know it. Somebody who arrived too soon, left too soon, whose life was too short. But there are small lives, but no small souls. Every soul is a long soul, a very, very long soul. And so what do we do with those we've known very briefly in life? The miscarriages, the suicides, the unexpected departures out of the blue that were devastating. How do we work with those? And what special magic do they have to offer? And I would offer that they do. Very, very, very complex, beautiful magic that they have to offer us when we begin to work with them. There is no such thing as a casual appointment with somebody from the other side. Every soul who meets ours, from every chipmunk we run over, has made an appointment with our soul. And we can work with that appointment and find out what gifts it has to offer us.
Module 6, connect with saints, deities, and ancient mothers for guidance and companionship.
So there are lots of ways of understanding how big the realm of the dead is. It's not just, my grandmother, my grandfather, my cousin, my ancestor who is this. There are saints, there are deities, there are beings of all different kinds. And we're going to look at the lore of the saints around the world and talk about how to play with the saints as we play with the dead. And not just traditional saints, but also secular saints. I'm going to tell you something. I've been talking about my daughter's genetic condition, her incurable genetic condition. Well, it turns out somebody very famous had that incurable genetic condition. And I pray to him every morning. And that is Saint Elvis. Elvis had the disease my daughter has, which is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which affected his heart and his GI system and his skin. It made why he could move the way he moved. And so I pray to Elvis to protect my daughter's heart and her body and keep her free from pain. And there are secular saints we can work with, and popular saints and traditional saints and all kinds of fun folklore that we can explore when we need help.
Module 7, devote yourself to the dead to transform your life and the world around you.
And so we're going to look at devotion. Devotion is a strange thing. We can get into a lot of trouble when we devote ourselves to the living. I always say I'm more scared of the living than I am the dead. I don't, watch out for the gurus on this side. But when we devote to the dead and devote ourselves to the dead, what does that look like? What does that become when we are devoted to them? When we literally place our words. Devow means to place our words back on the ground. What happens when we place our faith and our love back on the ground? Not up and away into some abstract stratosphere away from this planet, but back into the dirt and soil of this earth that is our home and is our body, will always be our home, will always be our body.
Well, what a delightful and fascinating curriculum you've created. So again, you can see more details on all these modules at collaboratewiththedead.com, collaboratewiththedead.com. So in this course, you'll get 7 90-minute live sessions with Perdita. That's going to include time to do interactive exercises and prayers and meditations, as well as Q&A time. You'll also have recordings of every session, video and audio, as well as word-for-word transcripts, which are helpful to go back with and study and highlight. There's weekly exercises and practices. There's a Facebook community to deepen your experience, which Perdita mentioned is really powerful because a lot of times it's difficult to shift out of one paradigm unless we've got a collaborative community around us. And then the magic can really start happening when it's normalized, when we have a community. And so that's part of why the Facebook community is so helpful. On the page, you'll also see at Collaborate with the Dead, you'll see a number of extra bonuses to enhance the journey that you'll take with this program. There's Everyone is Psychic, a conversation. This is a dialogue between Perdita and Mirabai Starr, who's a beloved Shift faculty member. You want to share a little bit about that bonus?
Mirabai is a beloved friend, and yet we've never had this conversation that we had in the bonus video, which I was fascinated by, which was her psychic perceptions that allowed her to translate St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa. And in fact, she said nobody had ever asked her that question, and she'd been dying to answer it. So you can hear her answer if you do the bonus video. And also, you can find out her really wonderful psychic perceptions about Julian of Norwich. I was really fascinated by these. I hope this is the beginning of a bigger conversation Mirabai and I are going to have about our psychic intuitions about various saints. It was really fun conversation.
Great stuff. There's also a PDF excerpt from the book that you mentioned, Take Back the Magic, Conversations with the Unseen World. It's called The Land of the Dead. And then there's one special bonus you get when you sign up right away by midnight Pacific time. And this gives you a little extra encouragement to tune in now while you have the most information and make a decision about whether you're moving forward. And if you do choose to move forward today, you'll get a video dialogue with Perdita and Mark Matusik, another Shift faculty member. It's called Proof the Dead Are Real. You want to share a little bit about the special bonus for today?
Sure. Mark told me he came to this work as an agnostic. And so, but he said that my book he found quite convincing. And so I said to him, well, let's do an experiment. Let's set up an experiment to prove to you the dead are real. So Mark and I have called on one of his beloved friends who's on the other side, who he lost to cancer a few years ago, who's going to help him with a project. And in August, he will report back to see what Robert has done. My guess is that Robert has come through, but we'll find out more about that and who he was to Mark and why that's so important to him. And what happens when we demand proof for ourselves, and that we can find the proof in these moments of miracles that happen for us. So we'll see what happens with Mark. I think we're going to have some surprises.
I love the experimental spirit in that. That's going to be great to find out. Well, it's going to clearly be a really fun and illuminating adventure for folks to go on this journey with you. And we've kept the investment really accessible. It's just 3 payments of $128, or you can save 10% when you pay in full with one payment of $349. The course is going to start August 1st and run Tuesdays at 9 Pacific, noon Eastern. But even if you can't make the live times, you can still get the full value with the recordings and the transcripts in the community as well. And I think you should also make a point to go to the page at Collaborate with the Dead and read through some of the testimonials. Just people love Perdita, master storyteller, challenging, magical, profoundly changed the way I see myself, total shift gift in my life. Profoundly enhanced by work with Perdita, and I cannot recommend this course enough. So you're in great hands, and there's a real spirit of fun and adventure in this program, and it really opens up a more playful and human way of connecting with the dead than you might have found elsewhere. And I think your life will be much richer for the experience and the practices you can develop. So again, you can find all the detail at collaboratewiththedead.com, collaboratewiththedead.com, and you get that special bonus with Perdita and Mark Matusik when you sign up by midnight tonight. So Perdita, it's been a delightful hour with you. Any final thoughts that you have for folks who are considering going deeper on this journey with you?
Anyone can do this. This used to be the everyday knowledge of our ancestors, and anyone can do it. And it isn't frightening. It's doable, easy, and it's life-changing. And it really makes the difference between living a life of anxiety and fear. This is the best anti-anxiety medicine I know. And to stepping into a world of joy and liberation and faith. And the ancestors really help you do that. I've watched people's lives transform, their relationships transform, their relationships with their families transform. Things that seemed impossible and intractable and hopeless suddenly blossomed into miracles. You can grow a miracle. Anyone can grow a miracle with the dirt of the dead. And I invite you, just like Mark Matusik, my friend, to come and put it to the test. You deserve a miracle. Why not give yourself one today?
Love it. Well, you are truly a delight to be with, Perdita, and thank you for just opening up your stories and your life and your practices to make this a miraculous multidimensional reality where we work with the dead on the other side. So again, thank you all for coming, and you're warmly welcome to go further, and you can do so at collaboratewiththedead.com, and you'll get the special bonus with Perdita and Mark when you sign up by midnight tonight. Thank you all. Many blessings.
Thank you, Stephen.